all, and welcome back to Ascendancy Gaming and the 4th episode of Zero to Hero for what is now an Infernal Blow Gambler. Just like the last episode, I've tried several different things on the build to try and get reasonable damage and, more importantly, decent defences. I'm briefly going to talk through the different things I tried and go through what I finally settled on. Before I started this episode, I actually had 2 to 3 different POBs in mind, and it's very difficult to know which one's going to feel better, so I tried lots of different setups. The good news is that along the way I had no issues farming currency. I've sold a ton of idols, I've got 2 dump tabs set up, one for 1 divine and one for 20c, and I sold a couple of idols for multiple divines. I've tried Harbinger farming, Abyss farming to get some quick XP, more destructive play, Exarch altar farming mainly trying to target Grand Embers, and the odd dabble into Simulacrum and T17 maps. Now my idol setups for all of these are not optimized, I'll just use what I've collected, with maybe purchasing the odd relic which might be essential to the strategy, so I'm not going to go through any of the setups because you can definitely do better if you spend time buying idols. I've again upgraded a lot of gear through relatively simple crafting or just buying on trade. So in terms of different setups, the first thing I wanted to try was Versatile Combatant. What this does is basically any over attack block cap you are, for every 1% over you get 2% spell block, but it reduces your maximum of both by 10%. So it's fairly straightforward to get 65% on each. I had to give up a little bit of damage, but I wanted to give it a try. In some scenarios, this felt amazing. So mapping, for example, I felt pretty much indestructible with this because along with that, I also crafted a chance to block Shaper Shield. So every time I block any damage, whether it's spells or attacks, I'd get 5% of my life back. And I could literally stand in mobs and I'd be pretty much invincible. This worked well for those maps, but when you start making the content harder, even though I had pretty high evasion chance and 65% chance to block, if I'm in tough content and I get hit, this character is going to die, and it happened a couple of times. It mainly happened when my flasks were down, so I maybe only had 80 to 85% chance to evade, my block is 65, and attack got through both, and it one-shot me. So I wasn't particularly happy with this because I've spent a lot on the character. I really didn't want a character that was just comfortable doing moderately rolled T16 maps, so we knocked that idea on the head. It might be something we'll come back to later, but 65% chance to block attack damage didn't feel enough. We do have 100% suppression, so even though spell block is nice to have, for the most part I should be able to survive spell hits. Next thing I wanted to try, since we're only 7 to 8 divines, is a Headhunter, and it worked great in general. The issue I've always had with Headhunter, and still have, is the stupid mod that makes you teleport around the map. It's just too frustrating in my opinion to deal with. It takes the fun out of Headhunter. There's also the mod that puts ice walls up. Because I'm not phasing, I will run into these walls, so I have to jump over them. Overall, it was just not a fun experience. I did 3 maps with the Headhunter and then I resold it. So after playing around with this setup for a bit, I decided that the Versatile Combatant route was probably not the way to go. There was still too much RNG for me as to whether I will die or survive. It did feel really good when all your blocks were proccing, especially with a life on block shield, but overall there was still something that felt missing. So we're back to the drawing board again. I'm going to sell the shield because I think it's pretty decent, and I've gone back to the shield I had in the previous video. What I actually decided when I was playing around in POE is that the nodes that give you more damage in terms of double and triple damage, they are good, but because it comes with a less damage overall, I think it's about 7 to 10% more DPS, and there were things I wanted to try to actually get defenses into the build. So what I've done is I've dropped the 50% ailment and stun nodes, and I've dropped the double damage and triple damage nodes, and I've gone and taken unlucky damage against you while you're on low life, and then lucky block. What this allows me to do is get to 94% chance to block, so I'll rely on suppression for spells, and evasion and block should pretty much mean I never get hit. I think the odds are like over 1,000 to 1 that an enemy actually connects with an attack. If it happens, I just have to accept that. I can get around the ailment immunity by taking a mastery, by making my implicit on my boots ailment immune, crafting max roll on my chest, and then I'll get around the stun by just getting some tattoos. So can we make use of taking less damage when we're on low life? And we can. The next part of the build was to try and get in Petrified Blood. What Petrified Blood does is you cannot recover to above 50% of your life without using a life flask, but 40% of any damage you take from a hit is basically mitigated, and then you lose it over time. Obviously we add things in like life recovery, leech, this also helps, and it basically mitigates that damage loss. So you take in essentially 60% of the damage that you would take. I will still be susceptible to a massive hit, but in terms of defensiveness, this has felt 100 times better than any other setup I've tried. What I did realize as well, because of where I was on the tree, that I could reserve an absolute ton of auras and still be okay. I'm able to reserve Anger, Grace, Vitality, the Petrified Blood, Precision, and Flesh and Stone. Now, it's mainly made possible on the tree by these nodes. I didn't realize that there were just overall reservation efficiency nodes on the tree. I thought they were all mana. These nodes here work on life and mana. What it means is I can get my mana just about in positive, but I can also get my life reservation enough that I can sustain lots of auras on my life without going below the 50%. I did need to add an Enlighten 3 into my auras, and I needed to take a 20% life reservation mastery, and this basically fits perfectly. As I said, I've had to make sure my mana cost is literally next to nothing for my skills because I don't have any. So I've taken some nodes on the tree. I've also linked life tap up where I can to skills to make sure that I basically never run out of mana. Now, a big physical hit or massive burst spell damage can still kill me, but the way I'm building the character, I'm never going to get it immune. I just want to get it so that for the majority of the time, it's a very, very comfortable experience. And this definitely feels like it with the Petrified Blood setup. There's a few things that help you sustain Petrified Blood. And the first is that you essentially get overleech if you make sure you don't reserve 50% of your life. So if you reserved 49% of your life, so you have 51% spare, the way it works is you will never be able to get between that 50 and 51% unless you use a life flask. Because you never hit your full life reservation, your leech will never stop. So you essentially get Slayer Overleech. I'm combining that with increased maximum leech, instant leech. We've got decent life regeneration. We have got an absolute ton to mitigate against damage, to the point where I can go against a level 10 corrupted blood and I will still maintain my life. This is obviously not ideal and is something I need to fix, but it just shows the sort of strength you can get by getting those sort of overleech mechanics into this build. Also need to remember that defensive wise, I still have 50% chance to defend against elemental hits with 90% resistances. So we're in the position now where we pretty much should never ever get hit by an attack if we do it super unlucky. We've got 100% spell suppression chance, and I will probably give up a point to get 3% extra damage reduced from a mastery. And offensively, I still invert resistances by 75%. So it still feels like it does enough DPS, but I do want it to do more. I also tried just playing around with retaliation skills, but because I've got really high chance to evade, I was only blocking spells, so it seemed kind of pointless. They were there just because they looked cool. I was using the one that freezes enemies so you can blow them up. It looked good, but it was totally pointless and didn't do anything to the build whatsoever. So along the way, there was lots of upgrades that I made whilst I was trying to figure out my best configuration. So the first thing I did was get a better Watcher's Eye. I had one that gave me evasion when affected by Grace. You can actually add fire damage while affected by Anger, and the jewel was 2 divines. So I purchased that, but it actually caused more problems than it was probably worth, but we persevered. What this did, even with big lightning damage on my sword, is it made it that fire damage was just rolling too high, so I wasn't able to proc Trinity. Some options were, do we just turn this into a pure fire build, but that means rejigging too much gear in the tree, so we needed to find a way to balance Trinity. I got a lightning damage jewel in my Stygian Vise. That helped a little bit, but there were still plenty of times when it wasn't up. So the only real option was going to be to drop a jewel and get an awakened added lightning damage. That's going to make sure that I have no problems proccing Trinity. Ruthless was the gem I ended up swapping. It is really good on single target, but in mapping it often doesn't do very much, so I decided that was the best gem to sacrifice. Unfortunately, this meant recoloring my chest, and considering I have a high dexterity requirement base and I only want 1 green socket, recoloring this was going to be an absolute nightmare. So the only route we could go down was 1 white socket in Harvest, and keep doing that until it turns one of the red sockets white. I got it on my second attempt, which I was happy with because it costs about 1.5 divines per attempt. So that meant I needed to spend even more money with the awakened added lightning, but at least now Trinity was resolved. I actually didn't notice the symbol not proccing, but I was doing some Guardian maps and the DPS just felt absolutely horrendous considering the improvements I've made on the build. And then I noticed when I was watching over the footage again that for the most part Trinity wasn't proccing, so fixing that was a massive DPS increase. I think I have settled on this version being the one I want to improve and push forwards in further videos. I feel like my defenses are good enough for me. I'm never going to get invincible without spell block and life on block, but the only deaths I took in the last simulacrum I run was because I'm not corrupted blood immune, and these things spawn all over the place. It just sit on the ground and constantly tick corrupted blood on you, and when you've then got enemies hitting you as well, I eventually get overwhelmed every now and again. However, if I can get corrupted blood immune, I'll definitely not have any issues. I think I could probably just get a worse jewel in my Stygian Vise that's corrupted blood immune, and that will do for now. We can work on a bigger jewel later on. So what changes did I make in the build? And there's quite a few in terms of gear. First thing I wanted to look at was my sword. My sword was one I crafted for like 4 divines. I was happy with it, but it could be a lot better. Once I sold my Headhunter back, I decided it would be time to craft a new sword, and the 8 divines I got for the belt should be plenty. The plan was basically to buy a T1 or T2 fractured cold or fire damage jeweled foil, use deafening essences of wrath until we hit T2 of the missing elemental damage. You then clean up the suffixes and multi-mod with crit and attack speed. As it turned out, early on I rolled a pretty decent sword, but it was missing the fire damage. So I basically crafted a suffix to block it and slammed an exalt, and I got lucky and hit big fire damage. So I'm essentially left with a sword that's slightly better than the one I would have had because it allowed me to craft crit multi on as a suffix. But even if I didn't get lucky, the final sword would not have cost a huge amount because essences are fairly cheap. The expensive part would be cleaning it up and multi-modding. But overall, no matter what the result, I would have been left with a sword that's 10 to 12% more damage than the one I currently had. I got a better large cluster, which did cost me 5 divines, which has got Sadist and Storm Rider on it. This gives me 60% increased elemental damage because I'm always applying all elements on an enemy. And it also gives me power charges pretty much all of the time. The other decision I made, because I was really struggling with crit, I still am now, and I've made loads of changes. So I sold my Lethal Pride for 3 divines and bought one for 1 divine that gives me double damage and intimidate, but in this jewel socket up here. Jewels are much cheaper in here because the majority of people will put them in the middle socket on the tree. So I then purchased a Light of Meaning jewel with crit chance, these are like 20c, and put this where my old Lethal Pride was. This jewel alone, because I take so many nodes in this area, it gives me 13.5% crit chance. This is sort of a band-aid fix and not ideal, but even with flasks up, I'm not that close to crit cap, so the more crit chance I can get, the better. I bought a large shred of hope to allow me to pick up the frenzy and endurance charges, and then that allows me to anoint Tribal Fury. It's a node I definitely want. Splash damage makes a massive difference in clear. I was anointing the endurance charge node before. I still wanted it because I need it on kill because I can't be bothered to keep using war cries. This fit the bill. They're quite expensive if you want one fairly well rolled, but it was something that I needed to get into the build. Now, one thing you might come across if you follow the build is resistances will become an issue because you will get less from your Thread of Hope and you get less from the passive points. So overall, it's a build you need to have more resistances than you would any other character for the most part. I crafted a better ring using Chaos Reforging Harvest, which unfortunately ended up with a big fizz roll on it. This ring is probably decent for someone who's running a fizz build. Not perfect for me, but it's good enough. The reason I'd held out on crafting a new ring, even though mine was not particularly good, is that I needed every point of intelligence on my old ring. Now that I've travelled up the tree to get an extra jewel socket, that gives me more intelligence on the tree so I don't have to worry about it. Combined with that, I bought a new helmet. What I needed was some strength and intelligence. I found this helmet, it was less than 1 divine. It's actually a really good helmet, but because it's on a base that isn't really that sought after, I got it cheaper than you'd get if it was on a decent base. This would probably be like 6 to 10 divines. I'll drop the tincture since I hardly have any mana. There's not much point running something that's going to drain me to 0 mana straight away. So I've just put Zeri's Promise in to cap Chaos Res and give me a little bit of extra damage. The next thing to look at was Fortify. Yes, Fortify from the gem is good because it's guaranteed every hit, but that could be replaced with a much better gem. So I did end up testing the implicit on a chess piece, and it works for the most part. There may be a few minor scenarios where you blow everything up with your AoE, you roll unlucky with your percentage chance, so you drop Fortify. But when you need it against single target and massive packs, it should be there. So with all the changes I've made, I've got to pretty decent damage. I would think with flasks and buffs up, it's about 10 million combined DPS. Now this is nothing to write home about considering the money I've spent, but I didn't want to just go damage. I wanted to make sure the build was comfy, and it is comfy. As long as you are hitting and leeching, you are very, very, very unlikely to die. Simulacrums, I've done a few now. I've never really felt like dying. The issue with them I have is my DPS isn't quite there, that they take too long to complete. and I need to be Corrupted Blood immune, which will work out in the next episode. So the build's now at the point where I'm really happy with the direction it's going. I just need more damage and CB immune. I pretty much never take an attack hit, but more damage means that I'm not going to get overwhelmed with spells if I can make sure I'm killing tanky packs really, really quickly or taking bosses down quickly, especially in things like Simulacrum. The quicker I kill things, the less chance I've got of being overwhelmed. So there's definitely some easy upgrades, if not expensive, that we can make just to boost damage. So Awakened Ellie damage with attacks would be about 6 to 7% more damage, but I need to save up for that. Corrupted Blood Jewel obviously will help us survive more in things like Simulacrum if I decide to farm them. And I'm sure there's loads more improvements I can make from here, but they're going to start being expensive. So I think from now, they're probably going to be episodes where we're just concentrating on more farming strategies, getting currency, and identifying exactly what items I want. Because I think the issues probably I've had with this series so far is I've had a very good idea of what I wanted to do, but nothing concrete. And I maybe didn't look deeply into POB to see whether it's going to feel like POB says it should. And I can't afford to do that if I'm going to be either self-crafting or buying specific items that are maybe only going to fit my build, and I'm spending 20 divines on an item. If that doesn't work, it might be a difficult item to resell, and it just means I'll waste time farming. Overall, I'm really enjoying the character. I would say the only issue I have is Gambler is just not as good as Slayer. I plugged my character into POB, changed it to Slayer, added a couple of damage while leeching crafts and clusters, and it was way better than the Gambler, and I have Overleech and things like that. So I think it's been a good experiment, but I think Gambler falls a little bit short. I think they should have been a bit more brave with the nodes. I'm really looking forward to the next episode. All of the gem links with a kind of description of how I think I built the character is in the POB if you need more information. Thank you very much for watching. Take care and see you in the next one.